Have you ever noticed how everyone around you seems to be moving, doing, achieving, yet nobody seems to be actually living? Look at the faces on the subway. Look at the people in line at the grocery store. Look in the mirror. There's this exhaustion that has nothing to do with how many hours you slept. This emptiness that has nothing to do with how full your schedule is. You're checking boxes, meeting deadlines, paying bills, showing up. But here's the question that terrifies most people. What are you showing up for? Because if you're honest, really honest, you'll notice something disturbing. You're not living your life. You're enduring it. You're not engaged with existence. You're negotiating with it, making compromises, cutting deals, just to make it through another week. Maybe you tell yourself, this is just how it is. This is what being an adult means. Or maybe you've convinced yourself that the weekend will fix it, that the next promotion will change things, that when you finally lose those 20 pounds, when you finally move to that city, when you finally find that person, then you'll start really living. But Carl Jung understood something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You are not preparing to live. You are choosing not to. And that choice, that refusal to engage with your own existence, is killing you more efficiently than any disease ever could. Jung called this the unlived life, and he believed it was the source of our deepest psychological suffering. Think about it. What percentage of your day do you spend doing what you genuinely want to do? What percentage of your conversations are real? What percentage of your choices are actually yours? This isn't just a philosophical question. It's a diagnosis of a modern epidemic. And this unlived life has a face. To understand how it takes hold, let me tell you the story of a man who, for 15 years, would have answered zero to all those questions. Marcus Richardson sat in his cubicle on the 3rd floor, staring at his reflection in the dark computer screen. Marketing manager, decent salary, a desk by the window that looked out onto the parking lot, and yet, sitting there at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday, with most of the office already empty, he felt a question rise in his chest that he'd been suppressing for years. Who is this person? Not in an existential, philosophical way, in a literal way. The man in the reflection, the one who'd learned to say the right things in meetings, the one who nodded along with his boss even when he disagreed, the one who smiled at jokes he didn't find funny, felt like a stranger wearing his face. Marcus had spent the last 15 years building this life. Community college, then night classes for his degree, the internship that became a job, the slow climb through middle management. He'd followed every step of the responsible script perfectly. And somewhere along the way, the person he actually was had been left behind like luggage at an airport, going around and around on the carousel, waiting for someone to claim it. But here's what Marcus didn't know yet. That feeling of alienation from his own life wasn't a problem to be fixed. It was a signal, a warning. His psyche was screaming that he'd traded his soul for a script written by people who would never have to live it. Carl Jung understood this pattern intimately. He wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." Marcus had been wearing someone else's shoes for so long, his feet had gone numb, and he was about to discover that numbness is just pain that's been ignored long enough to forget its name. It started with his hands. Marcus was in a client presentation, the kind he'd done 100 times before, when he noticed his right hand trembling, just slightly, enough that he had to set down his coffee cup to hide it. Then came the chest tightness, not a heart attack. He'd been to the ER twice to confirm. The doctors called it anxiety, gave him a prescription, told him to reduce stress, as if that was an option. Then the insomnia followed, the kind where you wake up at 3 a.m. with your heart hammering, mind racing through imaginary disasters, unable to name what you're actually afraid of. Marcus did what successful people do. He managed it. Downloaded meditation apps, tried breathing exercises, subscribed to a wellness program, read articles about high-performing executives and their morning routines. But the symptoms persisted, And worse, they evolved. Now it wasn't just physical. There were moments, sitting in traffic, standing in line for coffee, lying awake at night, where he felt completely disconnected from his own existence, as if he were watching someone else's life through a screen. One night, after another panic attack that came from nowhere, Marcus found himself standing in his bathroom, gripping the sink, looking at his own face in the mirror, and for the first time, he whispered the truth out loud. "I don't want this life." The words hung in the air like a confession. Jung saw this clearly in his patients. The unconscious doesn't give up. What we refuse to face directly, it will express through the body, through dreams, through symptoms we can't explain. Marcus's anxiety wasn't a disorder. It was a message. And the message was simple, brutal, and undeniable. The life you're living is incompatible with who you actually are. Marcus finally went to therapy, not because he wanted to, because his wife, Sarah, made it a condition of their marriage surviving. His therapist, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, had an office that smelled like coffee and old books. For the first 3 sessions, Marcus did what he always did in uncomfortable situations. Performed. He gave the highlight reel. Talked about childhood like it was a problem to be solved. Analyzed his relationship with his father like it was a case study. Dr. Rodriguez listened, nodded, took notes. And then, in their 4th session, she did something Marcus didn't expect. She interrupted him mid-sentence. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Who are you performing for right now?" The question landed like a slap. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. I'm just trying to give you the information you need to help me." Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward. "The information I need is not in your past. It's in this moment, right here. Because every word you're saying is carefully curated, edited, safe. You're giving me the version of Marcus that gets promoted. I need the version that's having panic attacks at 3 a.m. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. For the first time in months, tears came. Not the dignified, cinematic kind, the ugly, gasping kind that you can't control. "I don't know who that person is anymore," he managed to say. "Then maybe," Dr. Rodriguez said gently, "it's time to meet him." This moment, this crack in the performance, was what Jung called the beginning of individuation. Not the polished Instagram version of self-discovery, but the real, messy, terrifying process of becoming who you actually are instead of who you've been pretending to be. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." Marcus had spent 15 years avoiding his own soul. The body had finally made it impossible to continue. It was a Saturday. Sarah had taken the kids to her mother's for the weekend. The apartment was silent in that way that makes you hear your own thoughts too clearly. Marcus woke up at 6 a.m., not because of anxiety this time, but because of something else. Something that felt almost forgotten. Curiosity. He got up, made coffee, and instead of checking his phone, he did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the closet where they kept old boxes and pulled out his guitar. Dust covered the case. He couldn't remember the last time he'd opened it. College, maybe. Before the internships and the career trajectory and the person he'd become, his fingers found the strings. Clumsy at first. The calluses were long gone. But muscle memory is a strange thing. It lives in places that logic can't reach. He played. Badly. Wrong chords. Missed notes. It didn't matter. Because for the first time in 15 years, Marcus was doing something for absolutely no reason other than he wanted to. No productivity metric. No career advancement. No performance evaluation. Just the simple, almost forgotten act of doing something because it made him feel alive. And here's what happened. Nothing dramatic. No epiphany. No sudden clarity about his life's purpose. Just a small, quiet recognition that whoever was playing that guitar was more him than the person who went to the office every day. Jung understood this completely. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But here's the part Jung also knew. Becoming who you truly are requires letting die who you've been pretending to be. And that death, even when necessary, feels like loss. Marcus sat there, guitar in his lap, and felt the weight of a choice forming. He could put the guitar back in the closet, return to the script, keep managing symptoms, keep performing, or he could do something terrifying. He could start listening to the person holding the guitar instead of the person wearing the suit. Marcus decided to have coffee with James, his college roommate. They hadn't spoken in years, not really, just the occasional happy birthday text or LinkedIn congratulation. But James was the last person who'd known Marcus before the transformation, before the corporate persona, before the script. They met at a diner, the kind with vinyl booths and coffee that tastes like it was made yesterday. Small talk lasted about 10 minutes before James, who'd always been direct, cut through it. "So, are you going to tell me what's actually going on, or are we going to keep pretending this is just a casual catch-up?" Marcus felt his corporate smile falter. "What do you mean?" "Mark." James used the old nickname, the one no one had used in a decade. "I've known you since we were 18. I know when you're drowning." Something in Marcus's carefully constructed facade cracked. I don't know how to explain it. On paper, everything's perfect, but I feel like I'm living someone else's life." James was quiet for a moment, letting the words settle between them. Then, "You remember sophomore year, when you stayed up all night writing that short story for the literary magazine? The one about the guy who builds a perfect maze and then can't find his way out?" Marcus did remember. He'd forgotten about it completely until this moment. "You were so alive then," James continued. "Passionate, a little reckless. You cared about things, real things, not quarterly earnings or market share. When did that guy disappear?" "Around the same time being that guy stopped being practical." "Practical?" James shook his head. "You traded your soul for practical, and now you're having panic attacks. How's that working out?" The words hit like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, James's voice was gentle, but because they were true. Jung wrote about this exact moment. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. James wasn't trying to fix Marcus. He was just holding up a mirror, showing him what Marcus couldn't see because he'd been too close to it for too long. "I don't know how to be that person anymore," Marcus admitted. "I don't even know if he still exists." "Maybe you don't have to know," James said. "Maybe you just have to stop killing him." That sentence, "stop killing him," would echo in Marcus's mind for weeks. Because that's what he'd been doing. Every day, with every compromised decision, every time he said yes when he meant no, every smile that wasn't real, he'd been committing what Jung called partial suicide, the slow death of the authentic self in service of the adapted self. After the conversation with James, Marcus started noticing things. Not big things, small patterns, tiny betrayals, the way he changed his voice in meetings, slightly deeper, more authoritative, the way he'd agree with opinions he didn't hold, the way he'd laugh at jokes that weren't funny, the way he'd stay late not because work demanded it, but because going home meant facing the emptiness. He noticed how he avoided certain conversations with Sarah, how he'd become an expert at seeming present while being completely absent, how his kids knew to not ask him to play because daddy's busy was the only answer they'd get. But the pattern that disturbed him most was this. He realized he'd been making every decision based on one question. What's the smart move? Not, what do I actually want? Not, what feels true? But, what's the smart move for my career, my image, my trajectory? He'd optimized his entire life. And in doing so, He'd optimized himself right out of it. Jung called this the tyranny of the persona, the mask we wear to function in society. Jung wrote, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." Marcus had become a persona, a well-functioning, highly successful, completely hollow persona. And the terrifying part? Everyone loved the persona. His boss valued him. His colleagues respected him. His parents were proud. The persona was working perfectly. It was just killing the person underneath. One evening, sitting in his home office, Marcus did something he hadn't done since college. He pulled out a notebook, an actual physical notebook, not a device, and wrote, "I have become a very successful version of someone I never wanted to be." Below it, he wrote, "How do I find my way back?" He stared at the second question. Then, slowly, he crossed it out and wrote something else. How do I find my way forward? Because that's what he was beginning to understand. He couldn't go back to who he was at 20. That person was gone. But he could stop betraying who he might still become. The real breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Marcus had been dreaming, one of those vivid dreams that feels more real than waking life. In the dream, he was at his father's funeral. Except when he looked in the casket, it wasn't his father, it was himself. And everyone was crying, saying what a great man he'd been, how successful, how respected. And Dream Marcus was screaming, "But I'm not dead, I'm right here." No one could hear him. He woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. Sarah was asleep beside him. The apartment was quiet. And Marcus did something unusual. He got up and went to the bathroom, turned on the light, and really looked at himself in the mirror. Not a quick glance, a real look. What he saw shocked him, not because of anything physical, but because of what was absent. There was no life in his eyes, no spark, just exhaustion and performance and a deep, unnamed sadness. "This is what dying looks like," he whispered to his reflection. And then, something shifted. Maybe it was the dream. Maybe it was exhaustion finally breaking down his defenses. But for the first time, Marcus allowed himself to feel the rage. Not the managed, appropriate frustration he allowed in therapy. The real rage, the kind that lives in your bones. Rage at the 15 years he'd given to a script he never chose. Rage at the parts of himself he'd amputated to fit in. Rage at how good he'd gotten at pretending. Rage at the person in the mirror who'd let it happen. Jung wrote extensively about the shadow, the parts of ourselves we reject, repress, deny. He said, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." Marcus's shadow wasn't darkness or evil. It was his rage, his disappointment, his grief over the life unlived. All the parts he'd learned were inappropriate for a successful executive to feel. Standing there at 2 a.m., Marcus made a decision. Not a calm, measured decision. A desperate one. He was done managing symptoms. Done optimizing his dysfunction. Done trying to make a life that was fundamentally wrong somehow work. He didn't know what came next. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that the person staring back at him from the mirror couldn't survive another year of this. Something had to die. And for the first time, Marcus understood what, not him, but the idea of who he was supposed to be. Monday morning, 7:30 a.m. Marcus sat in his car in the office parking garage for 45 minutes. He had his badge, his laptop, his coffee, everything required to walk into the building and begin another week of the life he'd built. His hands were on the steering wheel, engine off, just sitting there. People walked past, colleagues, some waved. He waved back automatically. The performance was so ingrained it didn't require conscious thought. But inside, something was different. The question from the mirror was still there, pulsing. What if I just didn't? Not quit, not blow everything up. Just not perform today, not pretend, not manage everyone's expectations and comfort. What if just for one day he told the truth that he didn't care about the quarterly projections, that the strategy deck everyone was excited about felt meaningless to him, that he'd rather be literally anywhere else than in that building. His phone rang. His boss, probably wondering where he was. Marcus stared at it, let it ring, watched it go to voicemail. Then he did something he'd never done in 15 years. He started the car, backed out, and drove home. Not frantically, not dramatically, just turned around. Sarah was surprised to see him. "Did you forget something?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "I did." He went to his home office, opened his laptop. Not to work, to write. What came out wasn't organized or professional. It was raw, messy, years of suppressed thoughts pouring onto the page. Not for anyone else, just for him. Jung understood this moment. We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. Marcus had been living morning for 15 years straight. No afternoon, no evening, just endless morning, with all its striving and proving and performing. This wasn't the moment he quit his job or changed everything externally. This was something deeper. This was the moment he stopped colluding with his own disappearance. 3 months later, Marcus was still at the same company, same title, same cubicle, but something fundamental had changed. He'd started saying no, not aggressively, not dramatically, just no. "Can you take lead on this project?" "No." "Can you stay late tonight?" "No." "Can you be on this weekend call?" "No." At first, people were confused, then concerned, then surprisingly respectful. Because when Marcus said yes now, people knew he meant it. His word had weight because it was no longer automatic. He'd also started therapy twice a week. Real therapy. The kind where Dr. Rodriguez didn't let him perform or intellectualize. Where he had to sit with the uncomfortable truth of who he'd become and who he might still be. And he'd started playing guitar again. Not for any purpose. Not to become good at it or build a side career. Just to have one thing in his life that existed outside the optimization framework. Sarah noticed. "You seem different," she said one evening. "I can't explain how. Just different." "I'm tired," Marcus admitted. "But it's a different kind of tired. Before I was exhausted from pretending. Now I'm exhausted from being honest. It's better." The kids noticed too. His daughter asked him to play catch one Saturday. His instinct was the old response. "Daddy's busy," but he caught himself, looked at her face, and said, "Let me get my glove." It was just catch. 15 minutes in the backyard. Nothing special, except it was everything. Because Marcus was actually there, present, not thinking about work or optimizing or performing, just throwing a ball with his daughter. Jung wrote, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity." Marcus was learning to play again, not in the recreational sense, in the existential sense, to do things for their own sake, to be alive instead of productive. But not everything survived. 6 months in, Marcus had a realization that hurt more than anything else. Some relationships in his life existed only because of the persona. When the performance stopped, so did the relationships. Colleagues who he thought were friends stopped calling. The networking contacts faded. The social circle that had revolved around success and status quietly excluded him from gatherings. Even some family relationships strained. His father, in particular, couldn't understand why Marcus seemed to be stepping back from his career. "You're at the peak," his dad kept saying. "This is when you push harder." What his father couldn't see, what Marcus was only beginning to understand, was that the peak was a lie, or rather, it was someone else's peak. Someone who'd never asked Marcus if he wanted to climb that particular mountain. Jung warned about this. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Because accepting yourself completely means accepting that some people will only love the version of you that fits their needs. And when you stop being that version, you lose them. Marcus grieved these losses. They were real. But something else was also true. The space they left behind made room for something more authentic. James became a regular part of his life again. They started meeting for breakfast every other Sunday. Not to catch up on achievements, just to talk, really talk. Dr. Rodriguez once asked him, "What's different about who you're becoming?" Marcus thought for a long time. Then, "I'm becoming someone I don't have to recover from at the end of the day." That sentence sat in the room like a small miracle. The adjustment wasn't easy. The pressure to climb didn't go away overnight. There were expectations he had to actively push back against. But something else happened too. Sarah saw him again. Really saw him. The person she'd married before the constant striving consumed him. "I got scared for a while," she admitted one night. "I thought you were having some kind of breakdown." "I was," Marcus said. "But it was the kind of breakdown that's actually a breakthrough." Jung had a word for this. Enantiodromia, the process by which something becomes its opposite. The breakdown that becomes a breakthrough. The death that becomes a rebirth. 1 year after that morning in the parking garage, Marcus made a decision. He didn't quit his job. But he talked to his boss about a change, different responsibilities, more focused work. It meant staying at his current level instead of pushing for the promotion everyone expected. Less prestige, same money, but no more trajectory. His colleagues were confused. "Why would you do that? You're on track for senior management." Marcus didn't try to explain. There was no way to make them understand that he wasn't stepping back. He was stepping toward himself. Marcus's life looked smaller now by conventional metrics, but it felt larger, roomier, like he could finally breathe. He still had hard days, days when the old script called to him, promising safety and status. Days when he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. But then he'd remember the person in the mirror at 2 a.m., the one dying slowly while everyone applauded. And he knew he'd rather be uncertain and alive than certain and empty. On the anniversary of that parking garage morning, Marcus did something he'd been putting off. He wrote a letter, not to anyone else, to himself. To the person he'd been 15 years ago, standing at the beginning of the path that led to the corner office and the empty life. "Dear Marcus, you're going to spend 15 years chasing something. You're going to be very good at it. People will be proud. You'll look successful. But here's what I need you to know. You're going to lose yourself in the process. Not dramatically, not obviously, just gradually, like a photograph fading in sunlight. You're going to have a breakdown. It's going to feel like failure. But it won't be. It'll be the only honest thing you've done in years. I can't tell you not to walk that path. Maybe you need to walk it to understand why it's wrong. But I can tell you this. The person you're afraid of becoming if you don't follow the script, the one who doesn't have the corner office or the status, that person is freer than you can imagine. Some people will call what you're doing a midlife crisis. Let them. You'll know the truth. It's not a crisis. It's a long overdue awakening. And when you wake up at 2 a.m. and don't recognize yourself in the mirror, when your body is screaming with symptoms that don't have medical explanations, when you feel like you're dying slowly, that's not the end. That's the beginning. The person you're becoming is worth the pain of leaving behind the person you've been pretending to be. Trust him, Marcus. He folded the letter, put it in a drawer, not to forget it, but to have it there, a reminder on the hard days. Jung's final words on the subject felt right. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. Marcus had spent 15 years being what happened to him. The expectations, the script, the performance. Now, finally, he was choosing. And if you're reading this, if Marcus's story sounds like your own, if you've been living someone else's script while your real self slowly dies, this is your moment too. Subscribe, not because you want more content, Subscribe as a promise to yourself. A silent pact that you're done betraying who you actually are for the comfort of who you're supposed to be. Because no one is ever ready. But those who truly live, they choose themselves anyway. Even when it costs everything, especially then.